Good afternoon, folks. Nice to see that we have so many people here and still awake at 3:30. I keep saying Friday afternoon. It's not. It's Saturday. But anyway, welcome to one of the final sessions of the day. My name is Gail Hall, and I'm going to be moderating, basically timekeeping with discussions with these two fellows today. And we're hoping to have a good interactive session this afternoon. So throughout the 2 days, portfolios have been talked about a great deal as one of the key methods of assessment within the recognition of prior learning. What we're going to concentrate on today is portfolio assessment within academic credit, not from the perspective of developing it as a portfolio for your own skills identification, although that is part of it, but it's for the purpose of academic credit that the discussion is today. Our two panelists you've been introduced to before because you had Mark presenting the session yesterday from an advisor perspective, and today he's wearing the other hat. I sort of halfway because we talked about assessors also being advisors, etc. But he's going to be taking it from the perspective of assessment of portfolios, which if you were here yesterday, he also mentioned that he does for Athabasca University. And Clarence DeSchiffart, who you met this morning, and has also done a lot of work with portfolios, both from a career development and from the perspective with Nova Scotia Community College and others with the assessment of portfolios. So we wanted to start with a quote, which really was one of the initial instigators of this panel and this discussion. I don't know whether you're familiar with the website PLA.io, PLA Inside Out. It's an excellent website. It's just referenced at the bottom here for research articles and I would say opinion articles on prior learning assessment and recognition. And it has some excellent articles on there if you want to take a look at it for other topics. And Todd has an article on there about what is referred to as the new portfolio assessment. And as you can see here, basically what he's questioning is whether the assessment of portfolios is moving from where it was initially in looking for the reflective practice, what you learned and how you think you could apply it in various ways, to more, it's the art or the science, to more in terms of the rubrics and specific criteria on the knowledge and specific skills that people have to demonstrate evidence for. So part of the question we have today in the discussion is, when you are looking for people to use a portfolio as an assessment method for academic credit, what is it that you're looking for them to put in to that portfolio, and how are you going to assess it? So we're going to start actually from a little bit of presentation from each of these two in terms of background and opinion, thoughts, in approach to portfolio development and assessment for credit. So benefits, challenges, when you might use portfolio, when you might not. And then we will move on to evidence requirements, assessment criteria, and some of the rubric examples, this kind of thing. And we'll end up with, do you need to prove all of the learning outcomes? I think that was a discussion in one of the previous panels. And how are they shown on a transcript for a portfolio? So if you were in the last session, we'll see whether we have the same things that come out of here. So basically, if we start with just a little bit of these people's impressions and ideas about portfolios as an assessment method and some of the possible benefits and challenges. So I'm going to ask Mark to start.
No, you start. Okay, I'm happy to start. Thank you, Gail. Hello, everyone. Hope you're not too tired of me yet. I'm Mark Gallup, and I do assessments at Loyalist College for the Social Service Worker program and for the Facilitator of Adult Learning Certificate program. So I'm an assessor in both those programs. I'm also an advisor in both those programs. And I'm an assessor for Athabasca University's Bachelor of Professional Arts degree. And I'm sure most of you know that Athabasca University is an online university, and they send me e-portfolios to assess from people from across Canada. I think I assess about 8 or 10 of those each year. In the social service worker program at Loyalist and the facilitator program, I assess 40 to 50 portfolios a year. And that can be assessments of anywhere from one course request to the entire program request at Loyalist College. At Athabasca, their process is a little different, where you challenge usually it's like the third year of the degree. Most people have a college diploma and get the 2-year block credit, and then they challenge the third year. Some people don't go that route, but a lot of the portfolios I see have gone that route. So I assess for that. Athabasca has a rubric that they use, so they send me an e-portfolio and I review it. It takes about 45 minutes to an hour. And then I make my credit decision and score it on the rubric. There are 2 other assessors somewhere in Canada, I have no idea who they are or whatever, that receive the same e-portfolio. They also review it, score it. We email in our results, and the 3 sets of results are tabulated, and they go with the average finding based on that. And at Loyalist College, I don't use a rubric. I teach all the courses I assess or have taught those, and I use the course learning outcomes and the vocational learning outcomes as kind of the mental rubric that I use, and I work from that place when I do the assessments. So I think that's all I'd just like to say in a beginning kind of way. And I think Clarence and I are really going to be open to questions throughout, right? Yes. Clarence, we would like it to be a dialogue, and you can ask us anything you want about any of this stuff, and happy. Yeah, we have a question.
On that note, so do you...
Oh, sorry, I lost my mic. That was bad, right, Jerry? Okay.
Do you know what the scores are from the other people that you're grading with?
No.
Oh, okay.
And I don't see their... I do see their feedback, because they do say... I get the results of the final assessment.
Okay.
And I see my comments that I've added into it, and I see the comments of the other assessors.
Are you normally in line
And
with
I
each other?
see the total score, or the number of credits the candidate has been awarded. So it's a maximum of, I think, 30 credits or whatever. I forget exactly how that works. And sometimes the 3 assessors nail it. We all have awarded 30, and the person gets 30. And sometimes it's like 27, 25.
But you're always close.
Really, really
Okay.
close every time.
Thank you.
And interesting, even the feedback in what we're saying about the portfolio and the candidate is quite similar, quite often similar.
So that's the inter-rater reliability, and you're really doing it on a program basis, because you're not doing it against a specific course,
Right.
right?
And I have to say that even though it's a little bit technically oriented, I would say, it's within a holistic framework, the way Athabasca do their process. It's really good.
And, sorry, is that by program or by course?
By program. Yeah.
Was there another question? Did I see another hand? Okay, Clarence, we're going to ask you just to do an intro.
So I'm retired from the Nova Scotia Community College, and I was the coordinator of career and essential skills services. And in doing that work, I was asked to develop and teach a course on competency assessments. So if you're looking at RPL, this would be, again, a lot around summative evaluation. for both the college and for industry in the province of Nova Scotia. And this is why I think Mark and I have been asked, because I will talk more again about the rigor and credibility as it relates to portfolio from the perspective, again, of looking at what's the information we can glean from portfolio with again, agreeing about a holistic approach. And that's why I think it was helpful to, again, say the topic today is on, again, looking at portfolio for credit. And so some of the comments I'll bring will come from some of the things that Phil was talking about today in terms of systems in place and what those systems can mean for, I think, not only post-secondary institutions, but also when you look at career development as a whole, we can be helping people prepare for, I think, entry, or help people prepare to challenge for credit even though they're not formally attached to post-secondary learning. So I'm hoping that career development practitioners, and I see there is some organizations here that are representing that group of people to look at that. And I'll speak a lot more about benefits and challenges in a few minutes. At the Nova Scotia Community College, we were known for as being a portfolio college for years. And one of the things that has happened recently is that there's been a move away from really understanding RPL. It's kind of sad because it was really big with the previous president. That president moved on to Acadia University. He's retired from Acadia University this year. But I can tell you that the language and what RPL and PLAR, as it used to be called, has really changed dramatically. And we'll go back to talking about that quote in a few minutes, I think from different perspectives, that first quote.
Can I just ask here, for those in the room, how many of you actually allow program-based or cluster-based recognition of prior learning as opposed to individual course only? How many of you allow the program? Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, do either of you want to start with a discussion about some of the challenges of assessing portfolios against what you see as the benefits, and come back to the question about the reflection of learning and whether you consider that as a necessity in putting into portfolios when it's for credit?
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to talk about that, but let me start.
Go for it.
Let me start with what I want to talk about. And
There's a rebel in the crew. Thinking outside the box.
so, but those were interesting guiding points. So, the process for me begins when I meet the person as their advisor, and with Loyalist, different with Athabasca. But the process of assessment also begins in that very first meeting as their advisor. And it also begins the process of reflection, choice about whether they want to proceed any further, choice about how much they want to reflect on and what to reflect on, and then what to gather in terms of evidence and documentation, how much control they want over the process, and how long they want to take. We just talk about all that and we put it out there, and then we start on, do you want to look in the rear view mirror first, or do you want to look down the road first and set goals? And so I give them choice about where they want to start with their portfolio. And we also talk about, as you're reflecting on experiences, how do you glean the learning from them? And how do you declare that or describe that? And what do you do when you hit a painful or hurtful experience in your life? Do you choose not to touch that and leave it, which is completely fine? Or do you decide to look at it and say, and ask yourself, what have I learned from that? What can I take from that to use to help other people in my family, in my community, or whatever? And then what about the experiences around work and volunteering and raising your family and coaching a team and helping out at your church and other things, working in your community? We just start to move into that at the pace that the person wants to. So I'm still wearing the advising hat along that way and kind of coaching that process. But then I'm also starting to move into my own assessing of where this person's at and what would be some good courses that they could, in all likelihood, get credit for and think about doing some course matching with. And how to strengthen that by getting certain types of documentation. We call it triangulating, which is getting 3 diverse pieces of documentation that will provide enough evidence to support a claim for credit. And then we just kind of work away at that. We never quite know how long it's going to take, because for every person it's different. And it depends on if someone's just seeking 1 credit, then they may not want to go through all that other stuff. They might just want to get the documents together with a narrative and a course match and go, yep, I want to prove I've got the learning in this course and that's what I want to do. That's fine. But a number of people like Neil yesterday, I see lots of people who challenged the max, 75% of our program, which is 18 courses. And that's a big undertaking. That can take 4, 5, 6 months to do. But obviously the cost savings are really tremendous and the amount of time to get the diploma is quite significant and so on. So there's lots of benefits to that.
And Clarence, when you have people who are challenging through a portfolio, it sounds like Mark is doing the reflective process in the advising, the leading up to the portfolio. How does it work for you and what you look for in portfolioes?
At the college, what happens is that it goes to, again, each of the faculty, so similar process, and there'd be an administrator who would handle the incoming credit challenges. The information is up on the web page, so they would know what the process is. And so they would bring it to the subject matter expert in their academic faculty. And I'll speak about some of the challenges around that in just a second, or can I do that now?
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what's really interesting to me, because the quote for me is really interesting. I would not want to lose the holistic view, and yet I would say that one of the things I'll put out there and see what your reaction is, and this is why Mark and I are really open to dialogue, is that too much of the time the emphasis seems to be on one person view of what that student's bringing in. And at the Nova Scotia Community College, there's not enough emphasis on what Phil talked about, creating a system that has been done collectively. And so the investment in the front piece is, it's happening, and this is a challenge in the province of Nova Scotia, or most of the groups, it's almost too lax approach, because there's no specific clear-cut idea of saying that we were going to approach this as a faculty. We're going to train faculty in what RPL principles are so that the credibility and rigor is there, and it also helps them handle the workload. Because if I hear a complaint from faculty, it's that it's taking too much of my time on top of their teaching. And that I think can be addressed, I would think, again, by the investment of time, if the college would build in that investment to look at some of the things that we were exposed to this morning, to talk about, let's look at a system approach that still honors the uniqueness of each individual, but we are going to put things into place so it's upfront for the public as well as for the faculty. And there's such a variance of faculty support. The challenge in terms of going that route is to get faculty buy-in. And the buy-in is not there because not everyone believes that learning can happen outside the context of their particular course, which, I see some people shaking their head, unfortunately, it's still what we're up against in terms of the resistance. So if you have these pockets, and I think at one time Nova Scotia Community College was working on a college-wide approach, and it's unfortunate that if we could go back 15 years and take what we know now into that place, I actually believe with what we know now, and we brought it back there, but I reviewed some of the documentation at the Nova Scotia Community College on our from 15 years ago to take it into the competency assessment course, and it was just too vague in terms of what do people need to produce for evidence. And it almost seemed that, again, the concept of portfolio was that people would come with the binders, and it still is the debate, not a targeted binder, but again, a life in general type of binder. And so that's, when we're looking at application towards credit, I really believe that we can help students tune in some of those evidence, so have the dialogue about what portfolio can do. Somewhat what Mark said about, let's look at your life experiences, but here's what we're going to be aiming for, these life experiences as applies to these outcomes for the particular course. And so that's what I think is, again, some of the biggest kind of perception is that there's the few that want to stand up for support, but the credibility and the rigor hasn't been there, so it kind of gets pushed again to individuals who say, yes, I'll do it, but there's so many people that don't because of what it means in terms of their own work, and as Phil alluded to, their own anxiety about whether or not they're getting it right. Mark, I think, has been in the field for so long, so he used the word with me this morning, he pays attention towards his intuition. I'm a big believer in intuition, but we typically develop that intuition through, again, having structures that we can work through, at least my belief, so that the practice becomes more, again, intuitive. I can rely on that more and more because I've had these experiences behind me. But I think it's helpful that we create these structures for staff and for even in the career development area to help people get a sense of what are we talking about? What do you mean about these principles? What do you mean about these guiding posts? That sort of thing. So that's what I see kind of as challenges, and leaning against more, again, if we brought in these systems, credibility would go up. I think awareness would go up, and because it just takes one or two bad experiences to say, see, that student got credit for that course, and yet industry is saying they cannot do that job, or they cannot. If they go into other courses and they're having a hard time with those other courses, there's a lot at stake, I think, in terms of RPL. When you run into, well, again, those biases that Phil was talking about, where we just kind of, I'll just do it and say yes, yes, middle of the road, yes, yes, yes. So these are the kind of things I think we need to invest time and energy and be clear about those things.
So Clarence, what I hear you saying is that, the learning outcomes for the course may be there, but what you see as missing would be that support documentation for the students and the assessors to say what is expected, what's the criteria for assessment, what kinds of evidence are you going to be assessed against, right?
Yes, and not take away the flexibility that I think we want to create from the instructor, but have guideposts and maybe tools that we can become flexible with. But again, a collective group of people working on that together.
Yeah.
So shall we ask the audience here what their thinking is in terms of the structure and requirements for evidence?
I just have a comment around portfolio, having been involved in them for a few years, and that is about clearly defining the purpose of the type of portfolio that is to be submitted. And, when you talk about the benefits of a lifelong learning portfolio or a career portfolio, those may not be applicable. Evidence may be applicable, but the way the portfolio is done may not be applicable to the academic institution.
Yes.
And I remember the wonderful process piece of portfolio where people learn so much. The end product was often, based on that process. But what we needed to do as an institution was to work with that end product and say, there are things in your portfolio that are so beneficial to you and so important to this journey we've been on together. There are things in this portfolio that will be so important for the assessor. And let's take a look at those. Because I was always, as a facilitator, getting the feedback of, Deb, come on, it took me 3 hours. It's 3 binders.
Yeah.
And all I really wanted was these 4 pieces of evidence. So I quickly learned that, I needed to really, really work with it. And they all of those portfolios had amazing benefits.
Yeah.
That, they were just amazing. But having to sort of define what is my purpose for a portfolio was a really, and keep the process, but still maintain the process, Mark, which I
Yes.
think is so important.
Yeah, you don't want it to be too cumbersome for faculty or for the learner. And it is important to decide, is this going to be like a master portfolio, the grandma portfolios, from which you might draw documentation out to create mini portfolios for specific purposes. We used to teach a portfolio development course at the college, or offer, and I used to teach it, and it was a master portfolio course, but people could choose within the course to develop sort of mini portfolios for specific purposes like employment or getting a credit and that kind of thing. But they would develop the skill of how to do that once they've created their master portfolio. Could I also just add one quick point too, and it just comes back to it about the criteria for assessment. And I think it's good to have well-written vocational learning outcomes and course learning outcomes. That's very helpful. But I'm a little cautious about, getting too much into the whole performance criteria and all of that area, because learners bring a different sort of way to think about learning and experiences very often. It still matches the learning outcomes, but in a different kind of way. It's different than what you're teaching them in your classroom often. And it's still valid, sometimes even more relevant than what's going on in the classroom at times. It might be more current. And so I think we have to be careful around that piece of it. I'm just careful about that piece. Yeah.
I think my question relates to this very fully, which is the difference between data versus information, and about how you create a portfolio that doesn't contain all of the data, the 4 binders, but only contains the information that's relevant. Do you have any advice on as an assessor and as helping them build that process, about helping them separate out what is data noise and what is actually relevant?
Do you mind if I just go a quick one on that? Thank you. Yeah, and that happens right from the very beginning in the advisor role, is to find out what it is that they want to do, why are they there, what brings them to that interview, and then what is it, are they seeking to get recognition for 1 or 2 courses, or are they wanting to challenge an entire program, or sort of kind of figure that piece out first. And then get to know them a little bit more and ask them open-ended questions about, tell me more about your experience and so on. What types of documentation do you think you could gather up and pull together? And then, so you heard about Neil yesterday coming in to see me with these tote bags and all this stuff and just plopping it there. And that in some ways that's easier to work with, because then we could just start to zoom in on what's relevant. Let's take a look at the courses and what's relevant and what to include and what to leave out. And then just start to kind of work away at that. As the subject matter expert, you know what's the best pieces of documentation to include if they're seeking credit. You know what, you just know what to look for, and you can offer ideas around that. They may also offer some ideas about, well, what about this? Would that count towards this course? Do you think I should include that in there? Generally, the portfolios that I see are 1 binder. Takes me 45 minutes to an hour, but I have a portfolio eye now. I get that part too. But once you do more of this kind of stuff, you can do multiple course credit evaluations inside an hour. Faculty sometimes are afraid of that, but it's not that big of a deal once you kind of get doing them.
Clarence?
Again, going back to this idea that if you can give them an expectation about what you're looking for, and I think that sometimes even the notion of having examples of what people have submitted, and again, if you have colleagues saying, here's a variety of evidence, and again, take some of the best evidence, wipe out people's names so there's no identification, so people can see concrete examples of what met a learning objective for those courses. So if we're involved in assessments of this sort, that we start to save some of the best examples, it makes it, I think, clearer for people, not because they have to do it exactly the same way, but it gives them a range of possibilities in terms of looking at what would this evidence look like? Because I think that can be actually one of the most intimidating notions of creating a binder. And again, going back to the question, what's enough and what's too much? So I think examples in clear sense of checklists that say, okay, I've got this outcome I think addressed, I'm going to run it by my advisor, and it's just kind of putting that together. And Mark, I'm just curious, are you the advisor and the assessor at the same time?
Yeah,
So,
I am.
So that's interesting, because you might even be looking at some of the things we talked about today is, is it helpful to have a separate advisor that can have all these wonderful conversations, and does the assessor bring in their bias because they get to know the student in a different way, which again is talking about what Phil talked about today, and looking at what do we do to eliminate some of those potential biases that come in, because when you're meeting with people talking about their life experiences, of course, you really get to develop a strong rapport, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. I think it goes back to what Deb alluded to earlier, that we don't want to throw out the process of developing that rapport, but you want to have a more objective view, and so we can recognize that maybe that's one of the things we need to look at, because that's a system that's in place that someone like Mark has that role, but it's a dual role, and already that could be a conflict if you want to look at, are we getting to higher stakes assessment? How do we justify how he keeps himself from getting his bias? Well, I really like this person. And then you look at the evidence. So that's, I think, again, one of our challenges, to look at how much do we put a system in place that's a collaborative system.
And so I think one of the questions that's being asked here is that there's a difference between providing examples of the kinds of evidence you may be looking for and the criteria for assessing that evidence. But I'm also interested to know, because nobody's brought up or made the suggestion or asked the question, in terms of whether it's the same kind of thing in portfolios for all kinds of courses. In other words, somebody talked about accounting, somebody talks about literature, somebody talks about, English or something else. Are portfolios, or are there different kinds of portfolios, or different, and again, Deb talked about purpose, but Kate.
In our institution, we don't use the word portfolio, we call it an evidence file. And it is the evidence file. It's interesting that sort of duality of being both the advisor and the assessor, because I was trying to think, yes, you need a subject matter expert to be the advisor about what should be in that evidence file. And then unless you have multiple subject matter experts, that person may well be the assessor, but it might be good practice that one person on the program team is an advisor. If people do need advice, if you don't have the clear enough directions and examples, and another person perhaps to be the assessor. That's not the question you asked.
Well, in our circumstance, I assess just the courses that I teach with that person, but I refer the portfolio to other faculty when they're challenging courses that other faculty have the expertise in. I move the portfolio around. But the other part of this is, and advisors do need to know about assessment, and they also need to know a little bit about other courses in other areas as well. And so what I've learned to do over the years is compartmentalize my role to some extent, where I know where my role as an advisor ends, and when that hat needs to come off, when the portfolio's been submitted to be assessed, and when I need to put on the assessor hat. And it's a continuous relationship that in the assessment phase, if there are gaps in learning, and they already will have received coaching around whether there's a likelihood of getting a credit or they should take the course. When there's gaps in learning that are must know, the sort of the critical pieces, and there's a gap, I'll do a learning contract with that person to fill that gap. And it might be a set of readings or a small project or something to fill that gap so that they can still get that credit. If it's a significant gap, then I'll say, whoops, sorry, you're really going to have to take that course. That just doesn't happen because we do that in the advising phase. But there are gaps at times, and if it's a low stakes kind of gap, then I'll just have them do a set of readings and draw it to their attention. Here's a piece that you're missing. Often it's a piece of theory. They have all the practice laid out beautifully, but sometimes they've just missed a theoretical component. So for example, if it's a group dynamics course, they may know about conflict resolution, how teams work and so on, but they may not know the Tuckman stages of team development. And so I'll say, here's a piece, read this, give me an example. That kind of idea.
I just wanted to say something in support of Mark's advisor-assessor role, and just to mention that if anybody is faculty here, in a classroom situation, you advise and you assess all the time in that role. So I always got that question from faculty and staff at the college I worked at. Well, how is that fair? And I think what we came to was that can work. I can remember doing advising and assessing in my areas of expertise was early childhood education. And what became clear to us is that we knew the subject matter, we advised and we assessed the evidence collection that came in, but we also had and it wasn't a really, now when I think back, it probably wasn't as strong of a checklist as it could have been, that we used to complete the portfolio assessment, so the learner got feedback on that. So it spoke to how each of the outcomes was met. And then there were other things like was the evidence relatively current? Because currency, is really important, and in the classroom, your learners are current when they assess. And then, were there, say, direct documentation, for the outcomes. So you had your indirect and your direct documentation, that triangulation piece you talked about, which was so important because, boy, I've got 3 good pieces of evidence here that say this person. So I always felt that was a really good role. If that's the way it worked in a program, it worked really well. Yeah. But then we also did other ones where they put together an assessment file because they had a resource guide, and then it went off to the subject matter expert. But
and just I would still say that just a word of caution, if we want to sell RPL as being credible, if you have the resources and you have a team, so I'm just going to pretend, let's say Mark advises and Deb's part of his team, but she does the assessment piece, you're already increasing the chance of changing the optics, because that's part of the issue, is that if we listen to what some of the things that Phil talked about again today, the biases that come out, we're trying to create a picture that says we're being as not totally objective, but we're reducing the amount of subjectivity. So if you look at a system within your institution and applying for credit, this will help, again, with the external optics. I don't question what Mark's doing, because maybe he's the only person in his faculty that says, I'm doing it, and he has expertise that he brings in. With Athabasca, for example, there's that objectivity because you're not meeting with the students directly. But in-house, if we could start to think about what can we do in terms of creating those optics, I think it would go a long way in helping people recognize the object and the rigor and the credibility of assessing that, because they don't have the relationship directly with that student. But sometimes those resources are not going to be there. And because historically that is the way it's been happening. So are we at a time now where we can start to change the way, if the resources are there, about how we might do that? Build it into part of, again, that bigger system that I think we need to start going forward, looking at our systems that are in place. How do we account for these things? Yeah.
And assessors being trained.
Yes, assessors.
Yes. That, what I talked
Yep.
about was that the assessor knew those
Yep.
good assessment process, and knew that. So I think that's key. I think that's key.
Yep.
You know, Mark's.
So let's move on to the next part of it that adds to this in terms of the rigor and the transparency and the, in terms of how it's seen. And that is, what do you put into a rubric for assessing the portfolio? How detailed a rubric do you do? And do you show it to the students up front? Or is it only for the assessors? Clarence, do you want to start with that one?
Sure.
Let's switch it up.
Okay. Yes. I have 15 copies, and it's just a snapshot. So I'll get Gail to push these out at some of the tables. You can take a look at these and keep them, or just send me an email. But what you'll see in the rubric is, again, on the front page is an example of, here's the course outline, outcomes and objectives. I really think you have to get into the objectives. And on the second sheet, because the photocopier wouldn't do back to front, so there's 2 pages, is a list of criteria in terms of a rubric, again, that talks about exceeding, satisfactory, or pass, or below expectations, or missing piece, and additional feedback. I like to give them that up front, and in this case, there was another document that went with it, and that document was a rubric. This was actually for NSCC staff themselves. So this wasn't for students, but to get credit for it, they could apply for what they already knew. So I think that when I'm running this by, I rely on my colleagues to give me feedback. Is this clear? Does this make sense? And the feedback from it was very positive, as far as, again, saying I can demonstrate through my portfolio, and then even completing this additional piece that would summarize their own life experiences, because the course is called Career Development Matters, and they had to write their own career management plan based on all the theories of career development, looking at constraints in their own life, exploring. I said you had to pretend that you're actually going to leave NSCC and come up with options for yourself. And then you can go back to saying I want to stay at NSCC, but they had to write up this summary. So their portfolio would support where they may have achieved this, but they could still fill out this template along with their submitting their portfolio. So that you'll see on this, as an example, identifying what I hope are clear, and I even would say sometimes I quantify, because when I've asked for a list of personal preferences, saying who are you, I might get 3. And I know that we're much more complex than 3 statements. I couldn't answer that question, who am I, in 3 statements. So I would say, for example, I'm expecting 15 statements. And they're going, what? And if they fall short, the question is why? Because they're given access to tools that they can do some self-assessments to do something to that effect. What did it do? It gave people a sense of what they're aiming for. And that's part of always the challenge. So the template, the word template I created for them actually had instructions. You don't have that template, but had specific instructions say this is what's being looked for. So I think, again, that as we develop practices and we say what works well, we start to share that with our colleagues, it starts to broaden the breadth of what can we help students get a hold of, especially if they're aiming to get credit for it, that makes it sustainable for the student applying for credit as well as the assessor, which tends to be a faculty or subject matter expert. So it doesn't become an overwhelming, and that's what I often, again, am dealing with in terms of saying they just don't want to do it because they say it's too demanding. And that's because they haven't been trained in assessment. They haven't been trained in the whole system. That's I think, again, going back to a challenge.
So we'll hand these out while Mark answers the same question, just in terms of what you provide as a rubric and whether you hand it out ahead or whether it's just for assessors, and then we'll get some input as to whether what you do. Do you hand out rubrics for your, how many do portfolio assessment? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
lots of folks.
So we'll hand one or two of these out to each table as a sample.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, at Loyalist College, I don't use a rubric, but I use the learning outcomes from the courses that I teach as the measurement, as what I measure the learning against, and my own judgment and my own experience, and yeah, that's what I work from. Now, it's important to know I don't do this alone. I share this experience and have for many years with a colleague. Her name is Rosemary Reed. And we do this thing where we receive the portfolio. We, once it's been completed, we each read it independently. We decide on credit and at what grade level, because in Ontario we assign grades for PLAR credit. So the PLAR courses courses they PLAR are not distinguished in any way from taking courses regularly. So there's a grade assigned. And Rosie and I meet with the learner. We do our assessment. And then after we do the assessment, we indicate we've awarded the credit, and we let each other know what the grade is that we've assigned. And most of the time it's almost exactly the same grade, 80, 82, 95, 100, whatever it might be, or within 5 points. It's never, in all these years we've done assessments across hundreds of learners, it's never exceeded 5 points difference in her assessment and my assessment. And Neil made a comment yesterday where he used a similar process with his team in the Community and Justice Studies program, where they evaluated someone, assessed someone, and they came across a similar result. Because what happens is when you know your subject area and you understand how assessment works and you know what a portfolio looks like and you develop some confidence and comfort with it, you just get it. You know, it's nothing to fear. It becomes quite clear and obvious when they've had good advising. And I've only had one person, actually that person came through the Athabasca system, where I said I can't assess this portfolio, and it turned out that person had not received any advising. They just threw a bunch of stuff together and sent it off. That was so anyways, they ended up getting advising and did okay, but with good advising comes good outcomes. One part that we haven't talked about, though, is this process can be very transformational for people. I've learned that from my work with Indigenous people here and in Chile and in South Africa. This isn't just about getting a bunch of credits and having rubrics and all this stuff. I've learned it's way more than that. It's way more than that. Meet some of the people who have had transformational experiences using the RPL process. They'll tell you, well, I hardly even remember what courses I got credit for, but you won't believe how my life is different now. I see my family differently. I treat people differently. I think about learning differently. I'm excited about learning. I can't believe I have these things that I know that I didn't know that I knew, that now I value about myself. Like stuff like that happens. There's a power to that, and that's been the gift in this process from our First Nations partners in this for over 30 years. It comes from that place. I think we've drifted to a different place a little bit, but I think part of the reason I'm here and still doing this work on the planet, is to say, no, this is about people. This is about the gifts the Creator's given them and that they should come to discover and work with and develop and share with other people. That's how I've always approached it. Yeah, I play within the game of the system, but...
So let's get some input from you folks in terms of
Sorry about that
what
rant.
you put out and what you provide, or what your criteria is.
So I'm reflecting upon what you're speaking about in your question, and I'm the RPL coordinator at an institution, and so we do a bit of a blend. So if there is a rubric, we'll give it out to the student. Otherwise, we'll give the student the detailed learning outcomes so they know what it is that they're going to need to, like after a discussion with myself and with the subject matter expert usually. So there's like another type of a triangulation that actually happens between the advisor, assessor, and the student. So they're set up for success on what they need to know, because I'm not going to know with the hundreds of courses that we have how to advise every single student, right, on what types of evidence. But it's interesting. So I recently graduated from university and I PLAR'd 2 courses. And as part of my being a PLAR student, I expected to get a rubric. I expected to know exactly what my subject matter expert wanted. I wanted to speak to the faculty member. I wanted to pick their brains. I wanted to have really good advising. So I went, oh wow, do I ever need to kick my game up too? Because this is what a traditional adult learner
Yes.
is looking for. They want some clear direction, but then they want some flexibility to show you, this is what I know and this is how I can do it, and I want to shine you too, right? And another interesting piece, I don't know if this is talked about yet, I'm just going to kind of throw it out there and leave it, is the transcription of it. How we do it at our college was different than where I attended university and went to school. So another piece for me was I was graded on my PLAR, and I received grades for both of my attempts, and they were fantastic grades, which actually shocked me. I was like, wow. And it was like another tool of, wow, somebody else assessed this, and I actually did extremely well and nailed the competencies better than my classmates that were actually taking the course. But the interesting piece was when I got my transcript, I saw that I actually didn't get the grade for my PLAR. I got a credit recognition on my transcript, and I went, go.
Yep.
It impacts your GPA. And so we don't do it perfect at my institution right now either. We also give them a credit rating, so I know that I have a ways to improve in my institution as well. I just wanted to share that as a PLAR coordinator and a PLAR student.
Great.
Thank you.
Nice.
Other people who have comments on using portfolios and how much of a rubric you use, or whether you use, how many of you actually, just how many put CR on the transcript? Anybody put a mark or a percentage? 1. Okay, 2.
And that's a shame.
Just from our perspective, I'm at a post-secondary institution as well, and program is very narrowly defined, but we use 3 methods of assessment: portfolio, written case studies, and an oral defense as well. So the portfolio is structured based on 6 specific competencies. We haven't looked to achieve everything with a portfolio, just those 6 competencies. And they're clearly defined what the outcomes are for each of them. And when we first started the process, we were getting all sorts of evidence that was not really proving the point. I think everyone has the same problem where they're just throwing anything out there and seeing what sticks. So I've ended up having to put together a checklist, both for the assessors, because the assessors were having trouble as well, and the students, saying, before you submit your portfolio, have you got this and this and this and this for each of those 6 competencies? And we've had to beef up our list of examples of types of evidence that we will accept, because it started off as a little list, and then there's always an exception, and another exception, and exception.
Yep.
And the next thing you know, your list is huge. So, yeah, it's an ongoing thing, but it's been interesting. It's better now. The quality of our portfolios is better. Just having gone through that documentation, and the grading by the assessors is better as well.
Great.
Thank you. Other comments? One thing I'd like to ask is your terminology. Kate brought up that you don't use portfolios, you use evidence file. Do others have a different name for the process that we talk about as portfolio?
We sometimes call it an evidence package or
for portfolio students that what's a portfolio, they'll say it's an evidence package. And it's like, oh, so I would give you a bunch of documents. And it's like, yes.
Okay.
So,
Does anybody use portfolio assisted? Because,
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I ran into a situation in another country, actually, where they were using the phrase portfolio, but it included putting the results of tests and marked assignments that they had to do and other things within their portfolio. So it was a number of different assessment methods, but they put them all together for that then holistic final portfolio, per se.
So the reason I call it portfolio assisted is because except for Athabasca, I include an interview with the candidate to go over the results, also to ask them questions, because the portfolio is a static document, and sometimes there are things in the portfolio that I'll sort of, I call them clues, that I want to know a little bit more about because it'll help me round out my decision, the credit decision, or change the mark in my mind. And so I call it portfolio assisted assessment. And it's not a drill and grill session. It's actually pretty comfortable. We do it over coffee, and I talk about, here's what I found, and here's where we're at. Here's the credits, here's the marks, here's the plan to finish the program. And we just do it all in one swoop.
Like Australia calls it a competency conversation, which I kind of like.
Yeah,
It's just
that's
a
what
more
it is.
informal phrase in keeping that conversation going. Okay, Saturday night, Saturday evening. Do we have any final comments from our panelists here this afternoon?
Go ahead, Clarence. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say that two things. Mark's comment about process and how it can really be quite an empowering process, I think doesn't get lost when they're applying for credit, in that at first they might be applying for credit, but the notion of their life experiences really being the source of so much value add learning is an important one. And it really is quite rewarding for me as well to see what it does for people in terms of their own sense of self, the confidence there. And I just want to close with, again, when I'm back in the province of Nova Scotia, and I know my challenge with NSCC and industry is to bring some of the things, and I've worked with Phil Mondor now on 4 occasions, but I would encourage you to take what Phil presented today, and it was an awful lot, but that's Phil. And because he's such knowledgeable, and he really wants people to get it. He's passionate about it. I haven't heard him say anything that I would actually disagree with. Sometimes it's just like, I wish we had more time to practice it while we're together so we can have more dialogue, and that's an important component. But I would say that if we start collectively moving in that direction with our institutions, our career development centers, and whoever else is doing RPL, and my challenge is to convince industry, if you don't do this and you get a bad rap because you didn't follow your process, you can't not justify your system, that's what will bring years of hard work crashing down. And so I'm listening to Mark, and I think that wealth of knowledge that's inside of him, and I kind of go, it'd be nice for him to actually write some of it down so other people could learn from that. Because my guess, and this is a guess, I don't know Mark well, but he's probably, if he's competent in what he does, and that the competency assessments have been really good for students over these years, they're not going to question Mark's advising and assessing at this stage because they have evidence. They're assessing what Mark has done over the years. But in terms of going forward, we need to produce that maybe more outwardly, and at the same time, still honor the flexibility, still honor the intuition that Mark has brought to it, and that's what he shared with me earlier today, that we don't shut that down, but we say, can we capture that so that other people can benefit from that? So please do spend some time with that and get resources in to help you work through that system. which is a big investment up front, but it will pay dividends. I'm convinced of that for the RPL community across Canada. And we'll have more and more great stories because people are investing time into that.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Clarence. And Mark?
So the learning in this comes from the practice, just doing it. Practice, 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 get some feedback, work with some folks who really love to do the RPL work and help people with portfolios. Your life will be enriched in ways you won't even imagine. It's been the highlight of my career, has been working with adult learners, guiding them through this process. And you get so much more back. The other thing is, I would like to give a shout out to Phil because he put things in such a beautiful framework for all of us that lends credibility and strength to the work that we do and however we do it, whether it's portfolios or challenge exams or other methods. It's brilliant. And it's really lifted CAPLA up, I think, to have that kind of a framework for assessment. Really high quality. It's unchallengeable if it's done well. So that I send a thanks to Phil, who's on his way home,
And
I think.
Mark, I just added the quote that you liked to reference earlier in terms of the, subjectivity or objectivity of assessment.
Yeah, so this comes from the grandfather of PLA, or RPL, Morris Keaton, Dr. Morris Keaton. He was the first president of the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. And he used to come up to our conference in Belleville every year. He was like in his 80s, and he used to come up and just kind of hang out with us. And every once in a while, he would drop a gem. And this is a gem that we happen to capture, write down, and share with people about how people get all in a knot about, it's got to be objective. Well, guess what? It's really no such thing as pure objectivity. It's about the convergence of subject matter experts with a minimum reason for bias to come up with their sort of subjective judgments on things. And that was beautiful. And so in some ways, RPL is an antidote to elitism in education. And it's held up in a light that says, well, maybe there's different ways to think about this. And that's a good thing. So I want to thank you for coming to our session. I thought there'd be like 3 or 4 people showing up. This is great.
Solid and passionate RPL supporters here, right? Thank you, folks. It's been...
Can I just add one other thing?
Sure.
Sorry, because I share everything I have. I have portfolio guidebooks. I have institutional, adult learner-friendly institutional guidebooks. I've got all that stuff electronically, and if anybody wants any of it, just let me know, and I'm happy to send it to you.
That's
Okay?
one of the other beauties of RPL practitioners is the sharing in terms of, sharing the kinds of resources, etc.
Yeah.
So thank you all. Please join me in thanking our panelists here this afternoon.
Thank you. Good job, Clarence.
And
Pleasure.
we wish you a safe journey home
Yeah,
and
safe
dreams
journey.
of quality, passionate, fair RPL in the future and candidate-centered, learner-centered recognition of learning. So thank you all for your participation in the conference.